shit. Can you see me? Can you see me? Ew. Oh my god, you can... you can see my hand. Oh, does that mean you can see me as well? Well, I'm laying low for them. Okay, I should probably still lay low. Honestly, you've seen me. You've seen me. But we will do another chapter of the blog. Another few chapters. Interesting. We're still on the second section, which is aggravating. I just gotta look through where we are right now. Not there. Not there. I'm gonna close the door. Give me a second. Oh, vamp. Right. I'm gonna turn off the heater. Alright. Can you guys even see me? I'm trying to look through, but... So you guys can see that. So... around here, yeah. Around there. Good angle. Okay, I don't think you guys can see me. Alright. Let's go. We are on chapter Vamp now. So, Vamp, and we have two quotes. Doctors are men who prescribe medicines of which they know little, to cure diseases of which they know less, in human beings of whom they know nothing. And that is by the Voltaire, of course. Second one is, if we didn't kill the tumor, we killed the patient. And that was William Maloney in the early days of chemotherapy. Probably pronounced that wrong, but it's great when your last name rhymes with a piece of cured meat. Anyways. Vamp. High-dose, life-threatening 4-drug combination therapy for leukemia might have made obvious sense to Skipper, Fry, and Freireich. But to many of their colleagues, it was a terrifying notion, an abomination. Freireich finally approached Zubrod with his idea. I wanted to test them with full doses of vincristine and amethopterin, combined with the 6-MP and prednisone. The ands in the sentence were italicized to catch Zubrod's attention. Zubrod was stunned. It is a dose that makes a poison, runs the old adage in medicine. All medicines were poisons in one form or another, merely diluted to an appropriate dose. But chemotherapy was poison even at the correct dose. A child with leukemia was already stretched to the brittle limits of survival, hanging on to life by a bare physiological thread. People at the NCI would often casually talk of chemotherapy as the poison of the month. If 4 poisons of the month were simultaneously pumped daily into a 3 or 6-year-old child, there was virtually no guarantee that he or she could survive even the first dose of this regimen, let alone survive week after week after week. When Fry and Freireich presented their preliminary plan for Vamp at the National Meeting on Blood Cancers, the audience balked. Farber, for one, favored giving 1 drug at a time and adding the second only after a relapse, and so forth, following the Leukemia Consortium's slow but steady method of adding drugs carefully and sequentially. Oh boy, Freireich recalled, it was a terrible, catastrophic showdown. We were laughed at and then called insane, incompetent, and cruel. With limited patience and hundreds of drugs and combinations to try, every new leukemia trial had to wind its way through a complex approval process, through the leukemia group. Fry and Freireich, it was felt, were making an unauthorized quantum leap. The group refused to sponsor VAMP, at least not until the many other trials had been completed. But Fry wrangled a last-minute compromise. VAMP would be studied independently at the NCI outside the purview of the ALGB. The idea was preposterous, Freireich recalled. To run the trial, we would need to split with the ALGB, the very group that we had been so instrumental in founding. Zubrod wasn't pleased with the compromise. It was a break from his cherished cooperative model. Worse still, if VAMP failed, it would be a political nightmare for him. If the children had died, we'd be accused of experimenting on people at this federal installation of the NCI, Freireich acknowledged. Everyone knew it was chancy territory. Embroiled in controversy, even if he had resolved it as best as he could, Fry resigned as the chair of the ALGB. Years later, Freireich acknowledged the risks involved. We could have killed all those kids. But they didn't. Ooh, optimism. Optimism. We love some optimism here. Okay, that was the first break. But let's keep going. The VAMP trial was finally launched in 1961. Almost instantly, it seemed to be an abysmal mistake, precisely the sort of nightmare that Zubrod had been trying to avoid. The first children to be treated were already terribly, terribly ill, Freireich recalled. We started VAMP, and by the end of the week, many of them were infinitely worse than before. It was a disaster. The 4-drug chemo regimen raged through the body and wiped out all the normal cells. Some children slumped into near coma and were hooked to respirators. Freireich, desperate to save them, visited his patients obsessively in their hospital beds. You can imagine the tension, he wrote. I could just hear people saying, "I told you so. This girl or boy is going to die." He hovered in the wards, pestering the staff with questions and suggestions. His paternal, possessive instincts were aroused. These were my kids. I really tried to take care of them. The NCI as a whole watched tensely, for its life too was on the line. I did little things, Freireich wrote. Maybe I could make them more comfortable, give them a little aspirin, lower their temperatures, get them a little blanket. Thrown into the uncertain front lines of cancer medicine, juggling the most toxic and futuristic combinations of drugs, the NCI doctors fell back into their oldest principles. They provided comfort, they nurtured, they focused on caregiving and support, and they fluffed pillows. At the end of 3 excruciating weeks, a few of Freireich's patients somehow pulled through. Then, unexpectedly, at a time when it was almost unbearable to look for it, there was a payoff. The normal bone marrow cells began to recover gradually, but their leukemia went into remission. The bone marrow biopsies came back one after another, all without leukemia cells. Red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets sprouted up in an otherwise scorched field of bone marrow. But the leukemia did not return. Another set of biopsies weeks later confirmed this finding. Not a single leukemia cell was visible under the microscope. This, after near complete devastation, was a remission so deep that it exceeded the expectations of everyone at the NCI. A few weeks later, the NCI team drummed up enough courage to try VAMP on yet another small cohort of patients. Once again, after the nearly catastrophic dip in counts, like a drop from a cliff with a thread tied to your ankles, as one researcher remembered it, the bone marrow recovered and the leukemia vanished. A few days later, the bone marrow began to regenerate, and Freireich performed a hesitant biopsy to look at the cells. The leukemia had vanished again. What it had left behind was full of promise, normal cobblestones of blood cells growing back in the marrow. By 1962, Fry and Freireich had treated 6 patients with several doses of VAMP. Remissions were reliable and durable. The clinical center was now filled with the familiar chatter of children in wigs and scarves who had survived 2 or 3 seasons of chemotherapy, a strikingly anomalous phenomenon in the history of leukemia. Critics were slowly turning into converts. And other clinical centers around the nation joined Fry and Freireich's experimental regimen. The patient is astonishingly recovered, a A hematologist in Botten treating an 11-year-old wrote in 1964. Astonishment slowly gave way to buoyancy. Even William Dameshek, the opinionated Harvard-trained hematologist and one of the most prominent early opponents of VAMP, wrote, "The mood among pediatric oncologists changed virtually overnight, from one of compassionate fatalism to one of aggressive optimism." Okay, that was the second break, but let's keep going. The optimism was potent, but short-lived. In September 1963, not long after Frey and Freyreich had returned from one of those triumphant conferences celebrating the unexpected success of VAMP, a few children in remission came back to the clinic with minor complaints: a headache, a seizure, an occasional tingling of a nerve in the face. "Some of us didn't make much of it at first," the hematologist recalled. We imagined the symptoms would just go away." But Freyreich, who had studied the spread of leukemia cells in the body for nearly a decade, knew that these were headaches that would not go away. By October, there were more children back at the clinic, this time with numbness, tingling, headaches, seizures, and facial paralysis. Frey and Freyreich were both getting nervous. In the 1880s, Virchow had observed that leukemia cells could occasionally colonize the brain. To investigate the possibility of a brain invasion by cancer cells, Frey and Freyreich looked directly at the spinal fluid using a spinal tap, a method to withdraw a few milliliters of fluid from the spinal canal using a thin, straight needle. The fluid, a clear liquid that circulates in direct connection with the brain, is a surrogate for examining the brain. In the folklore of science, there is the often told story of the moment of discovery, the quickening of the pulse, the spectral luminosity of ordinary facts, the overheated standstill second when observations crystallize and fall together into patterns like pieces of a kaleidoscope. The apple drops from the tree. The man jumps up from a bathtub. The slippery equation balances itself. But there is another moment of discovery, its antithesis, that is rarely recorded, the discovery of failure. It is a moment that a scientist often encounters alone. A patient's CT scan shows a relapsed lymphoma. A cell once killed by a drug begins to grow back. A child returns to the NCI with a headache. What Frey and Freyreich discovered in the spinal fluid left them cold. Leukemia cells were growing explosively in the spinal fluid by the millions, colonizing the brain. The headaches and the numbness were early signs of much more profound devastations to come. In the months that followed, one by one, all the children came back to the institute with a spectrum of neurological complaints: headaches, tinglings, abstract speckles of light, and then slumped into coma. Bone marrow biopsies were clean. No cancer was found in the body, but the leukemia cells had invaded the nervous system, causing a quick, unexpected demise. It was a consequence of the body's own defensive system subverting cancer treatment. The brain and spinal cord are insulated by a tight cellular seal called the blood-brain barrier that prevents foreign chemicals from easily getting into the brain. It is an ancient biological system that has evolved to keep poisons from reaching the brain. But the same system had likely also kept VAMP out of the nervous system, creating a natural sanctuary for cancer within the body. Leukemia had grown out in that sanctuary, colonizing the one place that is fundamentally unreachable by chemotherapy. The children died one after the other, felled by virtue of the adaptation designed to protect them. Frey and Freyreich were hit hard by these relapses. For a clinical scientist, a trial is like a child, a deeply personal investment. To watch this sort of intense, intimate enterprise fold up and die is to suffer the loss of a child. One leukemia doctor wrote, "I know the patients, I know their brothers and sisters, I know their dogs and cats by name. The pain is that a lot of love affairs end." After 7 exhilarating and intensive trials, the love affair at the NCI had indeed ended. The brain relapses after VAMP seemed to push morale at the institute to the breaking point. Frey, who had so furiously tried to keep VAMP alive through its most trying stages, 12 months of manipulating, coaxing, and wheedling now found himself drained of his last stores of energy. Even the indefatigable Freireich was beginning to lose steam. He felt a growing hostility from others at the Institute. At the peak of his career, he, too, felt tired of the interminable institutional scuffles that had once invigorated him. In the winter of 1963, Fry left for a position at the M.D. Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. The trials were temporarily put on hold, although they would eventually be resurrected in Texas. Freireich soon left the NCI to join Fry in Houston. The fragile ecosystem that had sustained Freireich, Fry, and Zubrod dissolved in a few months. And that was this third break, sorry. But the story of leukemia, the story of cancer, isn't the story of doctors who struggle and survive moving from one institution to another. It is the story of patients who struggle and survive, moving from one embankment of illness to another. Resilience, inventiveness, and survivorship, qualities often ascribed to great physicians, are reflected qualities, emanating first from those who struggle with illness, and only then mirrored by those who treat them. If the history of medicine is told through the stories of doctors, it is because their contributions stand in place of the more substantive heroism of their patients. I said that all the children had relapsed and died, but this is not quite true. A few, a small handful, for mysterious reasons, never relapsed with leukemia in the central nervous system. At the NCI and a few other hospitals brave enough to try VAMP, about 5% of the treated children finished their year-long journey. They remained in remission not just for weeks or months, but for years. They came back year after year and sat nervously in waiting rooms at trial centers all around the nation. Their voices deepened, their hair grew back, biopsy after biopsy was performed, and there was no visible sign of cancer. On a summer afternoon, I drove through western Maine to the small town of Waterboro. Against the foggy, overcast sky, the landscape was spectacular, with ancient pine and birch forests tipping into crystalline lakes. On the far edge of the town, I turned onto a dirt road leading away from the water. At the edge of the road, surrounded by deep pine forests, was a tiny clapboard house. A 56-year-old woman in a blue t-shirt answered the door. It had taken me 17 months and innumerable phone calls, questions, interviews, and references to track her down. One afternoon, scouring the internet, I had found a lead. I remember dialing the number, excited beyond words, and waiting for interminable rings before a woman answered. I had fixed up an appointment to meet her that week, and driven rather recklessly to Maine to keep it. When I arrived, I realized that I was 20 minutes early. I cannot remember what I had said, or struggled to say, as a measure of introduction, but I felt awestruck. Standing before me against the door, smiling nervously, was one of the survivors of that original VAMP cohort cured of childhood leukemia. The basement was flooded, and the couch was growing mildew, so we sat outdoors in the shadows of the trees in a screen tent with deer flies and mosquitoes buzzing outside. The woman, Ella I'll call her, had collected a pile of medical records and photographs for me to look through. As she handed them over, I sensed a shiver running through her body, as if even today, 45 years after her ordeal, the memory haunts her viscerally. Ella was diagnosed with leukemia in June 1964, about 18 months after VAMP was first used at the NCI. She was 11 years old. In the photographs taken before her diagnosis, she was a typical preteen with bangs and braces. In the photograph taken just 6 months later, after chemotherapy, she was transformed. Bald, sheet white from anemia, and severely underweight, collapsed on a wheelchair and unable to walk. Ella was treated with VAMP. Her oncologists in Boston, having heard of the spectacular responses at the NCI, had rather bravely chosen to treat her off trial with a 4-drug regimen. It had seemed like a cataclysm at first. The high doses of vincristine caused such severe collateral nerve damage that she was left with a permanent burning sensation in her legs and fingers. Prednisone made her delirious. The nurses, unable to deal with a strong-willed, deranged preteen wandering through the corridors of the hospital screaming and howling at night, restrained her by tying her arms with ropes to the bedpost. Confined to her bed, she often crouched in a fetal position, her muscles wasting away, the neuropathy worsening. At 12 years of age, she became addicted to morphine, which is prescribed for pain. She detoxed herself by sheer force of will, she said, by lasting it out through the spasms of withdrawal. Her lower lip is still bruised from the time she bit herself in those awful months while waiting out the hour for the next dose of morphine. Yet remarkably, the main thing she remembers is the overwhelming feeling of being spared. I feel as if I slipped through, she told me, arranging the records back into their envelopes. She looked away as if to swat an imaginary fly, and I could see her eyes welling up with tears. She had met several other children with leukemia in the hospital wars. None had survived. I don't know why I deserved the illness in the first place, but then I don't know why I deserve to be cured. Leukemia is like that. It mystifies you. It changes your life. My mind briefly flashed to the Chiribaya mummy in Atosa. My mind briefly flashed to the Chiribaya mummy to Atosa, the Hallstead young woman awaiting her mastectomy. Sidney Farber never met Ella, but he encountered patients just like her, long-term survivors of VAMP. In 1964, the year that Ella began her chemotherapy, he triumphantly brought photographs of a few such patients to Washington as a sort of show and tell for Congress, living proof that chemotherapy could cure cancer. The path was now becoming increasingly clear to him. Cancer research needed an additional thrust, more money, more research, more publicity, and a directed trajectory towards a cure. His testimony before Congress thus acquired a nearly devotional, messianic fervor. After the photographs in his testimony, one observer recalled, any further proof was anticlimactic and unnecessary. Farber was now ready to leap out from the realm of leukemia into the vastly more common real cancers. We are attempting to develop chemicals which might affect otherwise incurable tumors of the breast, the ovary, the uterus, the lung, the kidney, the intestine, and highly malignant tumors of the skin, such as the black cancer or melanoma, he wrote. The cure of even one such solid cancer in adults, Farber knew, would singularly revolutionize oncology. It would provide the most concrete proof that this was a winnable war. And that was the chapter. And we will do maybe one more. Yeah, these are quite long ones. Okay, so how many chapters we got? 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we go to part 3. And those span around that's 40 pages. Yikes. Alright, let's go. I just farted, I'm sorry. Next chapter is an anatomist's tumor. And we have just one. It took plain old courage to be a chemotherapist in the 1960s, and certainly the courage of the conviction that cancer would eventually succumb to drugs. And that is by Vincent DeVita, the NCI investigator and eventually NCI director. On a chilly February morning in 2004, a 24-year-old athlete, Ben Orman, discovered a lump in his neck. He was in his apartment, reading the newspaper, when, running his hand absent-mindedly past his face, his fingers brushed against a small swelling. The lump was about the size of a small dried grape. If he took a deep breath, he could swallow it back into the cavity of his chest. Where is the tumor? A lump on his neck, but if he breathes in, he can swallow it back into his chest. Oh, what? Ew, but okay. He dismissed it. It was a lump, he reasoned, and athletes were used to lumps. Calluses, swollen knees, boils, bumps, bruises, coming and going with no remembered cause. He returned to his newspaper, and worry vanished from his mind. The lump in his neck, whatever it was, would doubtless vanish in time as well. But it grew instead, imperceptibly at first, then more absurdly, turning from grape size to prune size in about a month. He could feel it on the shallow dip of his collarbone. Ooh. Worried, Orman went to the walk-in clinic of the hospital, almost apologetic about his complaints. The triage nurse scribbled in his notes, lump in his neck, and added a question mark at the end of the sentence. With that sentence, Orman entered the unfamiliar world of oncology, swallowed, like his own lump, into the bizarre cavitary universe of cancer. The doors of the hospital opened and closed behind him. A doctor in a blue scrub suit stepped through the curtains and ran her hands up and down his neck. He had blood tests and x-rays in rapid succession, followed by CT scans and more examinations. The scans revealed that the lump in the neck was merely the tip of a much deeper iceberg of lumps. Between that sentinel mass, a chain of masses coiled from his neck down into his chest, culminating in a fist-sized tumor just behind his sternum. Large masses located in the anterior chest, as medical students learn, come in 4 T's, almost like a macabre nursery rhyme for cancer. Thyroid cancer, thymoma, teratoma, and terrible lymphoma. Orman's problem, given his age and the matted, dense appearance of the lumps, was certainly the last of these, lymphoma, cancer of the lymph glands. And that was the first break, and the first break of many. I'm just looking at these 2 pages and I see 3 breaks. Yikes. You know, it's a very dense chapter when you see breaks separated only by 2 paragraphs. Wow. I'm just gonna shuffle my cards. These cards aren't good. Can't shuffle well with them. Alright, I'm gonna drink some water as well. My hands are, not my hands, my mouth is very dry. Okay. Alright. I saw Ben Orman nearly 2 months after that visit to the hospital. He was sitting in a waiting room, reading a book. He read fiercely, athletically, almost competitively, often finishing 1 novel a week, as if in a race. In the 8 weeks since his ER visit, he had undergone a PET scan, a visit with a surgeon, and a biopsy of the neck lump. As suspected, the mass was a lymphoma, a relatively rare variant called Hodgkin's disease. More news followed. The scans revealed that Orman's cancer was confined entirely to one side of his upper torso. Give me a second. Something in my fingernail. I got a hangnail. Give me a second. Yeah, me pausing everything to get a hangnail off. Honestly, this isn't worth it. Let's just keep going. And he had none of the ghostly B symptoms, weight loss, fever, chills, or night sweats that occasionally accompany Hodgkin's disease. In the staging system that ran from 1 to 4, with an A or B added to denote the absence or presence of the occult symptoms, he fell into stage 2A, relatively early in the progression of the disease. It was somber news, but of all the patients shuttling in and out of the waiting room that morning, Orman arguably carried the most benign prognosis. With an intensive course of chemotherapy, it was more than likely, 85% likely, that he would be cured. Excuse me. Yeah, just do that to get all the burps out. Just punch your chest, dude. By intensive, I told him, I meant several months, perhaps even stretching out to a year. The drugs will be given in cycles, and there will have to be visits in between to check blood counts. Every 3 weeks, just as his counts recovered, the whole cycle would begin all over again. Sisyphus on chemotherapy. He would lose his hair with the first cycle. He would almost certainly become permanently infertile. Oh yikes. There might be life-threatening infections during the time when his white counts would bottom out nearly to zero. Most ominously, the chemo might cause a second cancer in the future. He nodded. I watched the thought pick up velocity in his brain until it had reached its full impact. It's going to be a long haul, a marathon, I stammered apologetically, groping for an analogy, but we'll get to the end. He nodded again silently, as if he already knew. And that was the second of these 3 very short, very close breaks. Damn, hangnail. Okay, let's keep going. Okay. On a Wednesday morning, not long after my meeting with Orman, I took a shuttle across Boston to see my patients at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Most of us simply called the institute the Farber. Large already in life, Sidney Farber had become even larger in death. The eponymous Farber was now a sprawling 16-story labyrinth of concrete, crammed full of scientists and physicians. A comprehensive lab, clinic, pharmacy, chemotherapy unit. There were 2,934 employees, dozens of conference rooms, scores of laboratories, a laundry unit, 4 banks of elevators, and multiple libraries. The site of the original basement lab had long been dwarfed by the massive complex of buildings around it. Like a vast, overbuilt and overwrought medieval temple, the Farber had long swallowed its shrine. Very cool. As you entered the new building, an oil painting of the man himself, with his characteristic half-scowling, half-smiling face, stared back at you in the foyer. Little bits and pieces of him, it seemed, were strewn everywhere. The corridor on the way to the fellow's office was still hung with the cartoonish portraits that he had once commissioned for the Jimmy Fund. Snow White, Pinocchio, Jimmy Cricket, Dumbo. The bone marrow needles with which we performed our biopsies looked and felt as if they came from another age. Perhaps they had been sharpened by Farber or one of his trainees 50 years ago. Wandering through these labs and clinics, you often felt as though you can stumble onto cancer history at any minute. One morning I did. Bolting to catch the elevator, I ran headlong into an old man in a wheelchair whom I first took to be a patient. It was Tom Fry, a professor emeritus now, heading up to his office in the 16th floor. Really? The Fry? And that was another break. Okay. How many pages? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8. My patient that one Wednesday morning was a 76-year-old woman named Beatrice Sorensen. Bea, as she liked to be called, reminded me of one of those tiny insects or animals that you read about in natural history textbooks that can carry 10 times their weight or 5 times their height. She was almost preternaturally minuscule, about 85 pounds and 4.5 feet tall, with bird-like features and delicate bones that seemed to hang together like twigs in winter. To this diminutive frame, however, she brought a fierce force of personality, the lightness of body counterbalanced by the heftiness of soul. She had been a Marine and served in 2 wars. Even as I towered over her in the examination table, I felt awkward and humbled, as if she were towering over me in spirit. Sorensen had pancreatic cancer. The tumor had been discovered almost accidentally in the late summer of 2003, when she had a bout of abdominal pain and diarrhea, and a CT scan had picked up a 4-centimeter solid nodule hanging off the tail of her pancreas. In retrospect, the diarrhea may have been unrelated. why does he add that? Yeah, cool. Just diarrhea, unrelated diarrhea. Like, wow, she had this whole cancer thing, and oh yeah, she also had diarrhea around the same time she discovered it. A brave surgeon had attempted to resect it, but the margin of the resection had still contained some tumor cells. Even in oncology, a dismal discipline to begin with, this unresected pancreatic cancer was considered the epitome of the dismal. Sorensen's life had turned upside down. I want to beat it to the end, she had told me at first. We had tried. Through the early fall, we blasted her pancreas with radiation to kill the tumor cells, then followed it with chemotherapy using the drug 5-fluorouracil. The tumor had grown right through all the treatments. In the winter, we had switched to a new drug called gemcitabine, or Gemzar, I don't know. The tumor cells had shrugged the new drug off, instead mockingly sending a shower of painful metastases into her liver. At times, it felt as if we would have been better off with no drugs at all. Sorensen was at the clinic this morning to see if we could offer anything else. She wore white pants and a white short. Her paper-thin skin was marked with dry lines. She may have been crying, but her face was a cipher that I could not read. She will try anything, her husband pleaded. She is stronger than she looks. But strong or not, there was nothing left to try. I stared down at my feet, unable to confront the obvious questions. The attending physician shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Beatrice finally broke the awkward silence. I'm sorry. She shrugged her shoulders and looked vacantly past us. I know we have reached an end. We hung our heads, ashamed. It was, I suspected, not the first time that a patient had consoled a doctor about the ineffectuality of his discipline. Okay. And that was another break. I didn't even see this because it was at the very end of the page. 2 lumps on 2 different mornings, 2 vastly different incarnations of cancer. One almost certainly curable, the second an inevitable spiral into death. It felt nearly 2,500 years after Hippocrates had naively coined the overarching. It felt nearly after 2,500 years after Hippocrates had naively coined the overarching term karkinos that modern oncology was hardly any more sophisticated in its taxonomy of cancer. Ormond's lymphoma and Sorensen's pancreatic cancer were both, of course, cancers, malignant proliferations of cells. But the diseases could not have been further apart in their trajectories and personalities. Even referring to them by the same name, cancer, felt like some sort of medical anachronism, like the medieval habit of using apoplexy to describe anything from a stroke to a hemorrhage to a seizure. Like Hippocrates, it was as if we, too, had naively lumped the lumps. But naive or not, it was this lumping, this emphatic, unshakable faith in the underlying singularity of cancer more than its pluralities, that galvanized the Laskerites in the 1960s. Oncology was on a quest for cohesive truths, a universal cure, as Farber put it back in 1962. And if the oncologists of the 1960s imagined a common cure for all forms of cancer, it was because they imagined a common disease called cancer. Curing one form, the belief ran, would inevitably lead to the cure of another, and so forth, like a chain reaction, until the whole malignant edifice had crumbled like a set of dominoes. That assumption that a monolithic hammer would eventually demolish a monolithic disease surcharged physicians, scientists, and cancer lobbyists with vitality and energy. For the Laskerites, it was an organizing principle, a matter of faith, the only certain beacon towards which they all gravitated. Indeed, the political consolidation of cancer that the Laskerites sought in Washington, a single institute, a single sort of funds, led by a single physician or scientist, relied on a deeper notion of a medical consolidation of cancer into a single disease, a monolith, a single central narrative. Without this grand, embracing narrative, neither Mary Lasker nor Sidney Farber could have imagined a systematic, targeted war. Okay, And that was our 5th break. Wow, we've got 3 more breaks to go. Let's go. I should drink some water first. The illness that had brought Ben Orgman to the clinic late that evening, Hodgkin's lymphoma, was itself announced late to the world of cancer. Its discoverer, Thomas Hodgkin, was a thin, short 19th century English anatomist with a spade-like beard and an astonishingly carved nose, a character who might have walked out of an Edward Lear poem. Don't know who that is. Hodgkin was born in 1798 to a Quaker family in Pentonville, a small hamlet outside London. A precocious child, he grew quickly into an even more precocious young man, whose interests looked freely from geology to mathematics to chemistry. He apprenticed briefly as a geologist, then as an apothecary, and finally graduated from the University of Edinburgh with a degree in medicine. A chance event enticed Hodgkin to the world of pathological anatomy and led him towards the disease that would bear his name. In 1875, a struggle with the faculty of St. Thomas and Guy's Hospital in London broke up the venerable institution into 2 bickering halves, Guy's Hospital and its new rival, St. Thomas. This divorce, like many marital spats, was almost immediately followed by a vicious argument over the partition of property. The property here was a macabre ensemble, the precious anatomical collection of the hospital. Brains, hearts, stomachs, and skeletons in pickling jars of formalin that had been hoarded for use as teaching tools for the hospital's medical students. St. Thomas's Hospital refused to part with its precocious specimens, so Guy scrambled to cobble together its own anatomical museum. Hodgkin had just returned from his 2nd visit to Paris, where he had learned to prepare and dissect cadaveric specimens. He was promptly recruited to collect specimens for Guy's new museum. The job's most inventive academic perk, perhaps, was his new title, the curator of the museum and the inspector of the dead. Hodgkin proved to be an extraordinary inspector of the dead, a compulsive anatomical curator who hoarded hundreds of samples within a few years. But collecting specimens was a rather mundane task. Hodgkin's particular genius lay in organizing them. He became a librarian as much as a pathologist. He devised his own systematics for pathology. The original building that housed his collection has been destroyed, but the new museum, where Hodgkin's original specimens are still on display, is a strange marvel. A 4-chambered atrium located deep inside a larger building, it is an enormous walk-in casket of wonders constructed of wrought iron and glass. You enter a door and ascend a staircase, then find yourself on the top floor of a series of galleries that cascade downwards. Along every wall are rows of formalin-filled jars, lungs in one gallery, hearts in another, brains, kidneys, bones, and so forth. This method of organizing pathological anatomy by organ system rather than by date or disease was a revelation. By thus inhabiting the body conceptually, by climbing in and out of the body as well, often noting the correlations between organs and systems, Hodgkin found that he could recognize patterns within patterns instinctually, sometimes without even consciously registering them. In the early winter of 1832, Hodgkin announced that he had collected a strange series of cadavers, mostly of young men, who possessed a strange systemic disease. The illness was characterized, as he put it, by a peculiar enlargement of lymph glands. To the undiscerning eye, this enlargement could easily have been from tuberculosis or syphilis, the more common sources of glandular swelling at the time. But Hodgkin was convinced that he had encountered an entirely new disease and an unknown pathology unique to these young men. He wrote up the case of 7 such cadavers and had his paper on such morbid appearances of this absorbent glands and spleen presented to the Medicinal and Chirurgical Society. chirurgical, surgical or chirurgical. I think it's chirurgical, but that sounds like a forming verb, dude. Okay. The story of a compulsive young doctor putting old swellings into new pathological bottles was received without much enthusiasm. Only 8 members of the society reportedly attended the lecture. They filed out afterwards in silence, not even bothering to record their names on the dusty attendance roster. Hodgkin, too, was a little embarrassed by his discovery. A pathological paper might perhaps be thought of little value if accompanied by suggestions designed to assist in the treatment, either curative or palliative, he wrote. Merely describing an illness without offering any therapeutic suggestions seemed like an empty academic exercise to him, a form of intellectual frittering. Soon after publishing his paper, he began to drift away from medicine altogether. In 1837, after a rather vicious political spat with his superiors, he resigned his post at Guy's. He had a brief stint at St. Thomas Hospital as its curator, a rebound affair that was doomed to fail. In 1844, he gave up his academic practice altogether. His anatomical studies slowly came to a halt. In 1898, some 30 years after Hodgkin's death, an Austrian pathologist, Karl Sternberg, was looking through a microscope at a patient's gland when he found a peculiar series of cells staring back at him. Giant, disorganized cells with cleaved bilobed nuclei, owl's eyes, as he described them, glaring sullenly out from the forest of lymph. Hodgkin's anatomy had reached its final cellular resolution. These owl-eyed cells were malignant lymphocytes, lymph cells that had turned cancerous. Hodgkin's disease was a cancer of the lymph glands, a lymphoma. And that was our 6th break. Okay, let's just keep on going because this section is quite short. Hodgkin may have been disappointed by what he thought was only a descriptive study of his disease, but he had underestimated the value of careful observation. By compulsively studying anatomy alone, he had stumbled upon the most critical revelation about this form of lymphoma. Hodgkin's disease has a peculiar propensity of infiltrating lymph nodes locally, one by one. Other cancers could be more unpredictable, more capricious, as one oncologist put it. Lung cancer, for instance, might start at a spigular nodule in the lung, then unmoor itself and ambulate unexpectedly into the brain. Pancreatic cancer was notoriously known to send sprays of malignant cells into faraway sites, such as the bones and the liver. But Hodgkin's, an anatomist's discovery, was anatomically differential. It moved as if with a measured, ordered pace, from one contiguous node to another, from gland to gland, and from region to region. It was this propensity to spread locally from one node to the next that poised Hodgkin's uniquely in the history of cancer. Hodgkin's disease was yet another hybrid among malignant diseases. If Farber's leukemia had occupied the hazy border between liquid and solid tumors, then Hodgkin's disease inhabited yet another strange borderland, a local disease on the verge of transforming it into a systemic one, Halsted's vision of cancer on its way to becoming Galen's. And that is our, 7th break? Wow, we have 3.5 pages. In the early 1950s, at a cocktail party in California, Henry Kaplan, a professor of radiology at Stanford, overheard a conversation about the plan to build a linear accelerator for use by physicists at Stanford. A linear accelerator is like an X-ray tube taken to an extreme form. Like a conventional X-ray tube, a linear accelerator also fires electrons onto a target to generate high-intensity X-rays. Unlike a conventional tube, however, the LINAC imbues massive amounts of energy into the electrons, pushing them to dizzying velocities before smashing them against the metal surface. The X-rays that emerge from this are deeply penetrating, powerful enough not only to pass through tissue, but to scald cells to death. Kaplan had trained at the NCI, where he had learned to use X-rays to treat leukemia in animals, but his interest had gradually shifted to solid tumors in humans. Lung cancer, breast cancers, lymphomas. Solid tumors could be treated with radiation, he knew, but the outer shell of the cancer, like its eponymous crab's carapace, needed to be penetrated deeply to kill cancer cells. A linear accelerator with its sharp, dense, lifelike beam might allow him to reach tumor cells buried deep inside tissues. In 1953, he persuaded a team of physicists and engineers at Stanford to tailor-make an accelerator exclusively for the hospital. The accelerator was installed in a vault-like warehouse in San Francisco in 1956. Dodging traffic between Fillmore Street and Mission Hill, Kaplan personally wheeled in its colossal block of lead shielding on an automobile jack borrowed from a neighboring garage owner. Through a minuscule pinhole in the lead block, he can now direct tiny controlled doses of a furiously potent beam of X-rays, millions of electron volts of energy in concentrated bursts, to lancinate any cancer cell to death. But what form of cancer? If Kaplan had learned one lesson at the NCI, it was that by focusing microscopically on a single disease, one could extrapolate into the entire universe of diseases. The characteristics that Kaplan saw in his target were relatively well defined. Since the LINAC could only focus its killer beam on local sites, it would have to be a local, not a systemic cancer. Leukemia was out of the question. Breast and lung cancer were important targets, but both were unpredictable, mercurial disease with propensities for occult and systemic spread. The powerful oculus of the Kaplan's intellect, swiveling about through the malignant world, ultimately landed on the most natural target for his investigation: Hodgkin's disease. And that was the last break. But let's keep on going after we finish our water. I'm already finishing my water. Can you see can you see my bottle? Can you see my bottle? Can you even see my hand? I thought you could see my hand. I don't know. Whatever. Alright. Sorry about that. Yo, I need water. That was not enough. My throat is permanently scarred. I'm kidding. It probably is, but you know. Ugh, man. Ah, scheisse, man. Scheisse. I slammed it down too hard. It revealed my Escher. Henry Kaplan was Hodgkin's disease. Henry Kaplan was Hodgkin's disease. George Kanenos, a former senior clinician at the NCI, told me. Oh my god, I'm neurodivergent. Henry Kaplan was Hodgkin's disease. George Kanenos. Fuck it. Henry Kaplan was Hodgkin's disease, said George Kanelos, a former senior clinician at the NCI, while leaning back in his chair. We were sitting in his office while he rummaged through piles of manuscripts, monographs, articles, books, catalogs, and papers, pulling out occasional pictures of Kaplan from his files. Here was Kaplan, dressed in a bow tie, looking at sheaves of paper at the NCI. Or Kaplan in a white coat standing next to the LINAC at Stanford, its 5 million volt probe just inches from his nose. Kaplan wasn't the first doctor to treat Hodgkin's with X-rays, but he was certainly the most dogged, the most methodical, and the most single-minded. In the mid-1930s, a Swiss radiologist named René Gilbert had shown that the swollen lymph nodes of Hodgkin's disease could effectively and dramatically be reduced with radiation. but Gilbert's patients had typically relapsed after treatment, often in the lymph nodes immediately contiguous to the original radiated area. At the Toronto General Hospital, a Canadian surgeon named Vera Peters had furthered Gilbert's studies by broadening the radiation field even further, delivering X-rays not to a swollen single node, but to an entire area of lymph nodes. Peter called her strategy extended field radiation. In 1958, analyzing the cohort of patients she had treated, Peters observed that broad field radiation could significantly improve long-term survival for early-stage Hodgkin's patients. But Peters' data was retrospective, based on the historical analysis of prior treated patients. What Peter needed was a more rigorous medical experiment, a randomized clinical trial. Historical series can be biased by doctors' highly selected choices of patients for therapy, or by their counting only the ones that do the best. Independently of Peters, Kaplan has also realized that extended field radiation could improve relapse-free survival, perhaps even cure early-stage Hodgkin's disease. But he lacked formal proof. In 1962, challenged by one of his students, Henry Kaplan set out to prove the point. The trials that Kaplan designed still rank among the classics of study design. In the first set, called the L1 trials, he assigned equal numbers of patients to either extended field radiation or to limited involved field radiation and plotted relapse-free survival curves. The answer was definitive. Extended field radiation, meticulous radiotherapy, as one doctor described it, drastically diminished the relapse rate of Hodgkin's disease. But Kaplan knew that a diminished relapse rate was not a cure, so he delved further. 2 years later, the Stanford team carved out a larger field of radiation involving nodes around the aorta, the large arch-shaped blood vessel that leads out of the heart. Here they introduced an innovation that would prove pivotal to their success. Kaplan knew that only patients that had localized Hodgkin's disease could possibly benefit from radiation therapy. To truly test the efficacy of radiation therapy, then, Kaplan realized that he would need a strictly limited cohort of patients whose Hodgkin's disease involved only just a few contiguous lymph nodes. To exclude patients with more disseminated forms of lymphoma, Kaplan devised an intense battery of tests to stage his patients. There were blood tests, a detailed clinical exam, a procedure called lymphangiography, a primitive ancestor of a CT scan for the lymph nodes, and a bone marrow biopsy. Even so, Kaplan was unsatisfied. Doubly careful, he began to perform exploratory abdominal surgery and biopsy internal nodes to ensure that only patients with locally confined disease were entering his trials. The doses of radiation were now daringly high, but gratifyingly, the responses soared as well. Kaplan documented even greater relapse-free intervals, now stretching out into dozens of months, then years. When the first batch of patients had survived 5 years without relapses, he began to speculate that some may have been cured by extended field X-rays. Kaplan's experimental idea had finally made its way out of a San Francisco warehouse into the mainstream clinical world. But hadn't Halsted wagered on the same horse and lost? Hadn't radical surgery become entangled in the same logic, carving out larger and larger areas of treatment, and then spiraled downward? Why did Kaplan succeed while others had failed? First, because Kaplan meticulously restricted radiotherapy to patients with early-stage disease. He went to exhaustive lengths to stage patients before unleashing radiation onto them. By strictly narrowing the group of patients treated, Kaplan markedly increased the likelihood of his success. And second, he succeeded because he had picked the right disease. Hodgkin's was, for the most part, a regional illness. Fundamental to all attempts at curative treatment of Hodgkin's disease, one viewer commented memorably in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1968, is the assumption that the significant fraction of cases, the disease is the disease is localized. Kaplan treated the intrinsic biology of Hodgkin's disease with utmost seriousness. If Hodgkin's lymphoma had been more capricious in its movement throughout the body, and the cold areas of spread more common, as in some forms of breast cancer, then Kaplan's staging strategy for all his excruciatingly detailed workups would inherently have been doomed to fail. Instead of trying to tailor the disease to fit his medicine, Kaplan learned to tailor his medicine to fit the right disease. This simple principle of the meticulous matching of a particular therapy to a particular form and stage of cancer would eventually be given its due merit in cancer therapy. Early stage local cancers, Kaplan realized, were often inherently different from widely spread metastatic cancers, even within the same form of cancer. 100 instances of Hodgkin's disease, even though pathologically classified as the same entity, were 100 variants around a common theme. Cancer possessed temperaments, personalities, behaviors, and biological heterogeneity demanded therapeutic heterogeneity. The same treatment could not indiscriminately be applied to all. But even if Kaplan understood it fully in 1963 and made an example of it in treating Hodgkin's disease, it would take decades for a generation of oncologists to come to the same realization. Oh my god. And finally we're done. I stammered so much to the point where it's just incomprehensible. Let's shuffle cards. Shit, didn't work. Shuffle cards. Boom, my best work. Okay, I'm gonna drink some water and then we're done. Because my throat fucked and it hurts now. Next chapter is 8 pages. Next chapter, man. So we've got what? 162 to 190, around like 30 pages. 30 pages to go until part 3. And what's the end? $585, I believe, right? 585 minus 162. $423 pages. And I have to do this in like 20 days. That means around like 20 pages a day, 21 pages a day. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Okay. Okay then.